Well, Imam al-Ghazali is the ocean. His own teacher, Imam al-Juwayni, said that he was bahrun mughriq, that he was an ocean that would drown you. That once you go into him, he is an ocean. And it's really important to emphasize when we talk about Imam al-Ghazali, radiyallahu anhu, is that he has been much maligned of late by our community, and unfortunately it's one of the signs of the latter days that the Prophet ﷺ told us that the people towards the end of the ummah would curse or speak ill of the people at the outset of the ummah. So this has to be fulfilled, I suppose, but I feel sorry for those people that are the ones that are fulfilling that hadith. So Imam al-Ghazali, as you can see, I'm using the term the oceanic Imam and Shaykh, the proof of Islam, the wonder of his age. And that comes from Imam al-Dhahabi, the great muhaddith and historian, who was famously a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, the faqih, and he was a polymath, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. But Ibn Taymiyyah and Imam al-Ghazali have a very interesting relationship. I mean, obviously Ibn Taymiyyah is after him, but in many ways Ibn Taymiyyah is responding to Imam al-Ghazali. So it's one of the dialectical conversations in our ummah. So Imam al-Dhahabi calls him al-Imam al-Bahr. And Bahr in Arabic can mean different things, but here it clearly means ocean. In the Dhahar al-Fasadu fil Barri wal Bahr, in the Quran, that actually means in the bed amongst the Bedou and in the cities. So the Bahr there means the Qura and the Mudun, because often cities are built by rivers or by oceans because of the trade, the importance of trade coming to them. So the Bahr can mean different things, but it's used for the meaning of ocean. And interesting is related to the word Hibr in the great derivation. So the Jews are called Ahbar because the Hibr is also the Bahr. He's the Bahr of ink. And the Prophet ﷺ, who is the great ocean that we all are either marveling at on the shore, or others have dived into his sunnah and are drowning in the glories of his sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ interacted with the ahbar and went and used to debate them. So the hibr is the person who spends a lot of ink in his occupation. So Imam al-Dhahabi calls him al-Imam al-Bahar, al-Shaykh, Hujjat al-Islam, wa U'jubatu Zaman. He is the hujjah of Islam, the proof of Islam, and the wonder of the age. And this is important because of who Imam al-Dhahabi is. He's clearly one of the great scholars of Islam. And so when a great scholar of Islam acknowledges another scholar and gives him titles like that, you have to take it very serious. Another great scholar, who is the polymath and the hafiz, Ibn al-Najjar, he actually says about the Imam, كان إماما في علم كان إماما بالاتفاق. He said Imam al-Fuqaha على الإطلاق. And then he said that he was also the Rabbani of the Ummah. Rabbani al-Ummah بالاتفاق. That's what he calls him. So Ibn al-Najjar, who was in Baghdad, and he lives after Imam Ghazali, not that long after Imam al-Ghazali, but he is one of the great imams of Baghdad. And he said that he was an imam in fiqh, ilm al-fiqh, ala al-itlaq. Yani he was, and he had mastered it. So he said he's the imam al-fuqaha, which means that he's really they're the master, faqih. And I'm going to go into that more, but so as we move in, I want to just begin before we get into Jawahir al-Quran, I'm going to take you through two doors. The first door, and which I'm going to look at inshallah today, is the door of the Imam himself, and looking at the Imam and why he's so important and why he has to be restored to his position. Because some people have tried to knock him off his pedestal, and this is not the first time that it happened. It's happened in the past. But he is the most important jurist after the first generation in the history of Islam. And he's also one of the most important theologians, and he is certainly probably the most important mystic of the Islamic tradition. So in that way, he is, after that first generation, he is the Imam of Iman, the Imam of Islam, and the Imam of Ihsan for the Sunni tradition. The Shia traditionally have had a difficult time with him because he did spend, the little time that he spent in refutation was in refuting the Shia. So unfortunately, because he's Iranian, one would think he would be one of the great treasures of Iran. He's not as appreciated, I think, as he should be, although the Shia did benefit from him, and Nasiruddin al-Tusi, who's a great Shia scholar, did. So he was born in Tus, which is in an area that was really called Khorasan. So today you can have Afghanistan, you have Turkmenistan, and you have northern Iran. All of that was called Khorasan. So the Afghanis are really Khorasanis, the Turkmenistanis are Khorasanis, and the people of northern Iran are Khorasan, because it's a Persian word that just means where the sun is. So from the sun is sun, is that right? Khorasan, it's, yeah, sun. So Khora is where it rises. Is that correct? Yeah. So he was born in this place in Tus in northern Iran, and his father was a simple, some say he was a Ghazal, like a person who was a wool carder, and that's why there's a debate about his name. Was he Imam Ghazzali, or is it Ghazali with a soft zay? But his father was a very simple man who loved the ulama. And he used to serve them, and he would honor them, and he would treat them and do whatever he could for them. And he made sincere dua to Allah that he had two sons, Ahmed and Muhammad. Muhammad is Abu Hamid. Ahmed becomes a scholar and a great mystic, but his son Abu Hamid really becomes Hujjat al-Islam. And I think it's from the sincerity of his father. But he was raised an orphan because his father dies in his early years. He left him to be taken care of by somebody. When the money ran out, he put them in a madrasa because he couldn't afford to keep them. And so they grow up in this madrasa in Tus, which is where he learns the beginnings of his knowledge. And he studied with an imam there, Radkali is his name. And he's very interesting. And then he moves to Georgian, that should say Georgian, which is Gurgan, which is near what they call Bahr al-Akhdar. And he studies there, many great imams from this place. Imam al-Jurjani was from there, both Jurjanis, because there's two of them. But really, truly extraordinary place of knowledge. So he goes there and he studies with Abu Nasr al-Ismaili. Some say he's Abu al-Qasim al-Ismaili. This is around 465. He was born in 450, and so he's about 15 years of age. So he's literally on his journey now. And he stays there with this sheikh who was a formidable sheikh in fiqh. And he memorizes Quran. He did that earlier. He studied Arabic. But he studies with him Shafi'i fiqh. And he basically writes what's called the ta'liqa, which is essentially all of his notes of the lectures. Because this is a time when scholars did what is called amali. They just yumli. So for instance, Sheikh Abdullah Mbayya has a book called Amali al-Dalalat, which is a very formidable book in usul al-fiqh. All of it was from lecture. He did it without notes, simply lecturing off the top of his head. His students recorded it, and then it was transcribed, and then he edited it. But those were his amali. Very few scholars can do that today. I know one Mauritanian scholar who told me that he could write in this moment, umli arba'ina kitaban fi arba'ina ilma. He told me I could dictate to you 40 books in 40 sciences. And he said, since I mastered those sciences, I've only been asked about 3 out of the so 37 he was never even asked about. So he basically writes on his, after 4 years, close to 5, after studying with this man, he's on his way back, and he tells this story where these brigands come and they basically rob the caravan. This was quite common in those days. And they rob the caravan, and so Imam al-Ghazali, I mean, you can imagine, he's 19 years old, and he's just studied, and he's mastered all of this knowledge that he's learned, but he hasn't memorized it. So he understands it, but he hasn't memorized it. So the thief takes his bag of books, and the Imam runs after him and begs him, please don't take my knowledge from me. And at that point, the thief laughs at him. And the thief says to him, what kind of knowledge is it that a wretch like me could steal it from you? Can you really call that knowledge? And Abu Hamid radiallahu anhu says, I knew then أَنْطَقَهُ اللَّهُ الَّذِي أَنْطَقَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, that Allah made him say that for me, to know that that is not knowledge. If it can be stolen from you by a thief, it's not knowledge. And so he goes back to Tus and spends the next 3 years memorizing everything he had learned by rote, so that nobody could ever take it from him again. And then at that stage, he sets out for what's called Nisabur or Nishapur. And this was another great center of learning in northern Iran. Today it's called northern Iran. And he studies with the great Imam Abu al-Ma'ali, Imam al-Juwayni. He's also called Imam al-Haramain. He was probably the most brilliant scholar of his age in fiqh. He was a Shafi'i jurist, but he was also an usuli, which means he studied legal philosophy, so the philosophy of law. And what's more important is he's really, even though arguably Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, and Imam Abu Hanifa all are working in a maqasidi approach. That's undeniable if you look at their methodologies. But it hadn't really been articulated. The beginnings begin with Imam Shafi'i when he writes his famous Risala. But then it's Imam al-Juwayni that really develops the maqasidi school. So he comes up with the 5 universals, that these are the maqasid of our religion, like protecting the religion itself, protecting life, protecting intelligence, reason itself, protecting family, and then protecting the property. And then sometimes they add a 6th, which is dignity, but most of them include that in family, because honor and that all goes under your name, because you carry your family name. So anybody that disparages it is disparaging your honor. So they put hifd al-ird in hifd al-nasl. So Imam al-Ghazali, now you can imagine the tawfiq that Imam al-Juwayni must have felt by having a student like Imam al-Ghazali, because he actually has him teach in his madrasa very early. So he studies with him there for 5 years. He goes there when he's 23. Imam al-Juwayni dies. But what's really important, this was a time when there was a lot of fitan. Imam al-Juwayni radiallahu anhu was actually, there were assassination attempts on his life. Because of the Batiniyah. He actually had to flee at a certain point. He's called the Imam al-Haramain because he goes to Mecca and Medina. He taught in Mecca and Medina. But he had the greatest student of the age. And it's just extraordinary that Allah brought those two together. And that's very important to remember that, you know, they say if you see a turtle on a fence, the one thing that you can deduce from that is that it didn't get there by himself. And there's a lot of truth to the fact that wherever you are in the world, you did not get there on your own. And if you study, it's your teachers that are going to make you or break you. I mean, it's the reality. Teachers will either turn you off of knowledge, and unfortunately many do that to young people, or they will ignite a fire in you that is in, it's just, the kindling is there. It's all ready, but it's a great teacher that will ignite that fire in the student. And this is, Imam al-Ghazali already had that fire, but when he goes to Imam al-Juwayni, amazing things happen. One of the first things that he does is he masters his book Al-Burhan in Usul al-Fiqh, and then he actually abridges it. So he abridges his teacher's book and then brings it to him and shows him the book. So he's very impressed with it. Then he goes, after Imam al-Juwayni dies when the Imam is 28, he actually goes to the court of Nizam al-Mulk. And you have to understand that Imam al-Ghazali will be the first to admit that he was an incredibly ambitious person. And in fact, so one of the things that the people of the spiritual masters of the religion say is that the last thing to leave the heart of sincere people is hubb riyasa, is love of leadership, because it's love of leadership that often it gets them there. Without that, they won't have that drive to outstrip everybody else, because they have that thoroughbred nature. And so he goes to Nizam al-Mulk. Now, Nizam al-Mulk, who was a Seljuk minister, Nizam al-Mulk was actually a righteous minister. The government arguably was not a great government like all governments. It had its problems, and there was a lot of dissent. But Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the things that he points out is that the idea that you cannot work with governments unless they're perfectly angelic is, he said, it's insane, because it will lead to all of the aspects of the religion falling into disarray, because governments are the ones that establish the mosques in Muslim countries. They're the ones that have the mahakam al-shar'iyya, the courts. They have the Dar al-Ifta, the fatwa places. So if all the ulama in their righteousness say, I'm not going to have anything to do with the government, then who runs the government? And I'll give you one example of this. There was a man named Muhammad Sharif, who was a Libyan, and he worked in the government under Gaddafi. And I actually visited him in 1978 in Libya with one of my teachers. And he hosted us. He was a beautiful man. He helped so many people. He helped Africans. He helped all. And then, but he stayed in the government for years, never said anything. He was doing everything in spite of what was happening. He hated Gaddafi. He hated the government. But he was a hidden man. He was like the mu'min amongst Ali Fir'aun, the believer within Ali Fir'aun. And they actually wanted to try him after the rebellion and the death of Gaddafi. But thankfully, because of the intercession of some good people, particularly the Jordanians, he was able to go to Jordan. He has spent his life doing tahqiq of Imam Ghazzali's works. He's one of the few people that did critical editions of his works. So that's an example of somebody. At the time, there were probably people that saw him, he's Alim Sultan, he's just working with the government. Imam Ghazzali went, and he said, تَعْلَمْتُ الْعِلْمَ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ فَأَبَى الْعِلْمُ إِلَّا أَنْ يَكُونَ لِلَّهِ. He said, I learned knowledge for other than Allah, but knowledge refused to be other than for Allah. And so, even though he might have had his niyyah was not always the best, his path, because he was a sincere seeker, his path was his purification. And so he went through great tribulations. So he gets into the court, he completely floors Nizam al-Mulk, who was an alim himself and was surrounded by ulama. And he sees him as somebody, this man is going to be very useful. And because Nizam al-Mulk had a project. At the time they were cursing the Ash'aris on the minbars, literally cursing them, the Ash'ari mutakallimun, the theologians. There was a lot of fitna in the community. The Ismailis, the Batiniya, were very strong, the occultists, and I'll talk about that later. So there's all these problems, and it's just amazing what he does, because he comes in and he can win every argument. He is just so formidable and so irrefutable that the ulama just, they can't handle him. And so a lot of envy, a lot of jealousy, but Nizam al-Mulk sends him, he becomes a full professor in Baghdad at the Nizamiyya. Now you have to understand at the young age, I mean, he's in his early 30s. And he's a full professor at a place where most of these teachers are going to be in their 60s and 70s, right? So it's quite stunning. But then he has a crisis. The crisis comes about the age of 38. He goes into what we would call an existential crisis. In the West, they'd probably call it a midlife crisis, where he really he goes through a period of radical skepticism and doubt. and just is wondering. And this is partly because of his own genius and because he penetrates so deeply into things. But he really begins to question everything. And because of that, he actually loses the ability to talk. He can't teach anymore. And this is a man who the ulama came to listen to. So Ibn Aqil, the great grammarian and scholar, used to come and sit. I mean, this is a man who the great ulama of Baghdad would come to sit in his lectures. That's how formidable he was. But he just can't talk. And the doctors basically say, you need a psychologist. You know, we're physicians. We can't do this. You need somebody alim al-nafs, because it's not a physiological problem. This is a psychological problem. And so he basically decides to just really examine everything. And he identifies 4 sources of knowledge. He calls them the theologians, the mutakallimun, and then the falasifa, the rationalists, and then the batiniya, the occultists, like people that seek knowledge through the occult, through hidden, arcane knowledge, esoteric knowledge. And then finally the mystics, who at that time were called Sufiya, which should not be confused with what a lot of people associate with so-called Sufiya, because there's a lot. Imam Ghazzali was one of the great critics of these so-called Sufis. And he was actually, if you look at him, he's far more critical of Sufism than not in the Ihya. He's constantly condemning a lot of practices. But he recognized intuition, that the knowledge that the people of Tasawwuf are talking about is intuitive knowledge. It's kashf knowledge. And he realizes that this is essentially real knowledge, because there's a Berkeley professor, Paul Feyerabend, who wrote a book called Against Method, in which he argues, it's a very radical book, and I'm not recommending people read it, but I did read it many, many years ago. And one of the arguments he made, which is very interesting in the book, is that he said that scientific method has never helped any major discoveries in science. All major discoveries in science were intuitive. Scientific method is what helps the dummies understand it. But the actual breakthroughs came from great moments of insight. And you will find this, many of the Nobel Prize winners. I mean, Linus Pauling, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, he saw the whole thing in a fever, like in his mind. Now, one could argue all their study helps produce those moments, and that's very possible. But the point is, intuition is an underrated understanding of knowledge, heads, because all of knowledge is founded on the concept, and the concept is mystical in its essence. Just the fact that we have consciousness, the fact that we can see things and perceive them, and then take the one out of the many and abstract, and all these things are coming out of an intuitive source that we don't understand. Some will call it the agent intellect. There's a lot of debates about where that knowledge comes from, but essentially it is a mystical type of knowledge that is the foundation of all knowledge. And so he realized that that was the real, true knowledge. But it's not easily acquired. And so he goes into seclusion. This is a very early, I think this is the first picture of Damascus. If you see the minaret on the right, apparently that is the minaret where he actually resided for over a year. Some say 18 months. I mean, there's debates about this. Even in his own book, there's some debates. I mean, some people have accused him of prevarication in the book, which I don't think is fair, because, first of all, people, when he was in the state that he was in, one wonders just what was going on in his mind, because he was in a very profound state of hayra, aporia. So, but he does spend time there, and this is where he begins to write the Ihya Ulum ad-Din. This is part of his project, but not all of his project. And then he actually goes to Damascus, to Jerusalem, and he writes his Risala al-Qudsiyya there, what's called Qawa'id al-Aqa'id, which is really a fundamental book in Kalam, which I'll get to. And then he goes, some say he visits Egypt. There's a debate about this. He was planning on visiting Yusuf Teshafin. Yusuf Teshafin is the great Murabit leader who actually conquers Andalusia. It was Imam Ghazzali who wrote him a letter arguing to him that he must go and save Andalusia, because if he doesn't, it will fall to the Christians. And so some say that it's actually Imam Ghazzali that led to the Murabitun going into, in the famous battle in Zallaqa, where they defeat the Christians, and then he restores the unity of Andalusia after it had fallen into what are called Muluk al-Tawaif, very similar to what's happened today in the Muslim world. So, and then he goes on, he makes his pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. And during this time, I mean, there's wonderful stories about him, but during this time, he was literally sweeping the mosque in the Umayyad mosque. This was the man who had been a dean at the greatest university in Iraq, and he's just wants to be left alone, and he wants to work on himself. And then he goes back to Baghdad and spends a short time there. And at this time, he's about 49 years old. So some say, and there's debates about this, and I'm going to take the Imam at his own word. There are debates about this. Some say, and the Persian letters indicate that he actually was gone less than that. He was probably gone about 2 years. But for whatever time, he was in seclusion. This was a time the great jurist Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi visits him. And Qadi Abu Bakr, who is really one of the masters of the Islamic tradition, he was a brilliant exegete of the Quran. He was a great Maliki faqih. He actually went and visited, and he's the last student in Iraq that Imam al-Ghazali took. And he read with them the Ihya. He takes back Imam al-Ghazali's teachings to Morocco, and then it begins to spread. Initially, the Murabitun rejected his book because of some of the kalam problems that they found in it. They were much more Salafi in their orientation, and by Salafi I mean not Mujassima Salafi, but the traditional Salafi, not anthropomorphous, but the people that were dogmatic, following like Imam Tahawi type texts, very simple. They didn't like any elaborate dialectical theology. So he then basically goes to Nisapur, and he teaches in the Nizami. At this time, he's teaching usul and other things, but he's about 50 years of age. Then he goes back to Tus. He opens up a zawiya, what they would call I think they called khanaqa, khanaqa. So he opens up a type of place where he's really doing character development and spiritual work and teaching. Most of the time was spent in recitation of Quran at this stage in his life. He was reciting the Quran at least once a week, and with great deliberation. In 40 years, he wrote 72 books. Some will argue because the books are, like the Ihya has 40 books, so you could look at it as 40 as opposed to just one. So some say it's actually 400 books if you look at them, but I think it's around 70, 72 books. Somebody worked out, given the amount of paper, he would have had to write 4 kurasa every day in his entire adult life, from the time he was about 18 until the end of his life, to actually write what he'd written, which is about 40 pages a day he would have had to write. So incredible output. So now I want to talk, and this is really at the heart of what I wanted to talk about today. I want to talk about what is his project, because Imam al-Ghazali has a project. It's the Mashru' al-Ghazali. It's the Ghazalian project. What is that project? First of all, and I use the term liberal arts. I mean, traditionally, this is a Western term. I like it because it's understood in the West. But it really is the same concept as the term that was used in the Muslim world as the ulum al-ala. These are the instrumental arts. They're the arts that are studied to train the mind so that the mind can actually begin to understand reality. And so this is part of his project. And from that, his whole focus is on reviving the sciences of Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. And then that involved kalam in Iman, legal theory in Islam, and then the inner path in Ihsan. as a side project, he has the refutation fundamentally of two groups that had huge impact. One of them was the peripatetic philosophers, and the other were the occultists. The peripatetic philosophers, and it's important to remember, when they say that he destroyed philosophy, he was focusing on one school of philosophy, which is the peripatetic school. And he identifies 20 problems, 3 of which he considered to be really kufr, and then 17 of which to lesser and greater degrees. But the methodology of the philosophers he recognized as the best methodology. And this is why he was not opposed to philosophy, but he was opposed to the results of certain schools of philosophy. This is really important to understand. Ibn Khaldun, who wrote considerably against philosophy, in the Muqaddimah says, despite the errors of the philosophers, their methodology is the best methodology. So even Ibn Khaldun admitted this. Imam Ghazzali is the one that introduces the methodology of the philosophers into kalam, into usul, and arguably into ihsan. So, and for that reason, Ibn Taymiyyah, and in many ways, I think, really motivated from a very pure, he had a very pure intention, I think. But I don't think he recognized what the Imam was trying to do and why he was doing it. The Imam saw the fragmentation of the Ummah. Well, he saw what was happening. And he recognized that there were tools out there that we would need to protect this religion from the onslaught from outside. And it's not to say that the religion itself wasn't enough. It is enough. But the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min, that wisdom is the lost property of the believer, like a lost riding beast of the believer. Wherever he finds it, wherever he finds it, he is more worthy of it because he will use it for the right reasons. So he really saw that there was great benefit in these tools. In the same way that Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari recognized the same thing in his Kalam project. Ibn Sina, who is much maligned in our community, unfortunately, was an absolute genius that we should be incredibly proud that Allah made him from this ummah, because he is one of the greatest thinkers in human history. And Peter Adamson actually argues that he's probably the single most influential philosopher in European history, not just and he's an expert, obviously, on Ibn Sina. But Avicenna, his right now, the quarantine, this is even though the Prophet ﷺ first articulated the quarantine, Ibn Sina was the one that said it should be for 40 days. He said people should wash their hands with vinegar because these diseases are spread by what he called ajsad mu'dhiya, like harmful bodies. Viruses aren't even living things, according to most scientists. There is a debate, but most of them say they're not living things. The viruses. They behave as if they were, but they're actually not. They're just genetic material, just material that have codes in them that corrupt our cells. So the project is a formal one. So in the liberal arts, he has 2 fundamental books that are really important. The first one is called Mi'yar al-Ilm, and this is his theoretical book. He wrote it, it's a book of logic, and he wrote it because he felt that the human mind was so fallible that it needed to be trained. So this book is literally the grammar of thought. Now, most people, when they learn a language correctly, and I know there's debates about this, but I actually believe in prescriptive language, so I'm going to use the word correctly. There is incorrect usage of language and correct usage by grammatical terms. A lot of people don't like these terms anymore, but so be it. The grammar of thought is to learn how the mind should work properly when it reasons. That's what the grammar of thought is. So this is called mantiq. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a book called Radd al Mantiqin. Even though he was a logician, he wrote a book called Refutation of the Logicians. Because he said, and this is a very interesting statement, he said, logic does not benefit stupid people, and it's superfluous for highly intelligent people. That is absolutely true. The problem is most of us fall in the bell curve, in that middle. And this is why the Sahaba didn't need mantiq, because the ones that were fuqaha and were reasoning with their brilliance. And so people that are highly intelligent generally don't need mantiq. But they still will benefit from this training, but they don't need it. So mantiq is to teach people of lesser capacity how to avoid pitfalls like hasty generalization. It's a logical fallacy in what's called material logic, because we do that naturally. I had 3 South Asian taxi drivers in New York. They all cheated me, so every South Asian is a cheat. That's obviously a fallacy. So but that's how the mind works. So that's his first book, and it's a brilliant book. We're actually, alhamdulillah, it's been translated and it's being edited now, and so we're actually, this is going to be part of the Zaytuna curriculum series. So alhamdulillah, that book should be out hopefully within the year. The second book he wrote, which is, I think, one of the most extraordinary books in ethics, and that is Mizan al-Amal, which is, so the Mi'yar al-Ilm is the standard of knowledge. Mizan al-Amal is the scales of action, so that you could weigh every action and determine whether the action was worthwhile or whether it wasn't. So it's a book of virtue ethics. It's a brilliant book. It's heavily influenced by the great polymath and Persian scholastic Raghib al-Isfahani, who wrote one of my favorite books, Al-Dhari'atu ila Makarim al-Sharia. So now, just in Iman, he wrote his 2 most important books. One is the abridged version, the other is more extensive, are Qawa'id al-Aqa'id and Al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad. So economy in belief, and the other one is the principles of the axioms of creed. Now, so he has his project of introducing the approach using logic in scholastic theology. Now, it's important to remember, the last book that he wrote probably is called Iljam al-Awam an Ilm al-Kalam, not allowing common people to study theology. So he was not somebody that really encouraged, but he recognized that a certain group of scholars must learn this because it will enable them to refute the obfuscations and the attacks of the religion by people from outside. So for instance, right now we have all of these philosophers. We have deconstructionists, we have structuralists, we have post-modernists, we have post-colonialists, we have all these different, we have critical race theorists, we have all of these, and then we have also the analytic school. We have people that are working within that school, not just philosophers, theologians like Alvin Plantinga, who I was fortunate enough to be part of the award ceremony, a brilliant scholar working within a certain school of philosophy to defend faith. So he understood that you're always going to have these people out there who use their intellects and sophistry to confuse people. And if you don't have people trained to recognize it, to see it, and to be able to refute it, you're going to get into trouble. And what will happen is you will be left to the argument of blood. That's when you can't defend your religion with intelligence, the people that are zealots, that don't have the intelligence or the training to defend it, will end up defending it through violence. And that's not a defense of religion. Blood is no argument. So that's a really important thing to remember. Now in Islam, he took the abridgments of Imam al-Juwayni. Imam al-Juwayni wrote a famous book called Nihayat al-Mattab fi Dirayat al-Madhab in the Shafi'i fiqh. It's a very important book, but he takes it and he writes a long abridgment of it, a middle abridgment, and a short abridgment. Al-Basit, Al-Wasit, and Al-Wajiz. In fact, one of the Abu Hafs, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz al-Tarablasi, early on, only 10 years after the Imam died, he died. He said, شَيِّدَ الْمَذْهَبَ حَبْرٌ أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ خَلَاصَهُ في بسيط ووسيط ووجيز وخلاصة. So these are the 4 books in Furu' that Imam al-Ghazali writes. The people who are Shafi'i know this. Imam al-Ghazali is the most important, after Imam al-Juwayni, I mean obviously the Imam himself, Imam Shafi'i, but all of the later books that come after, including Imam Nawawi, are all dependent on the books of Imam al-Ghazali. So these are foundational books in the madhab. This is in furu', not in usul. So this is in the branches of jurisprudence and not in the legal philosophy. Now in Ihsan, he writes a beautiful short book called Bidayat al-Hidayah, which is really to prepare a person for the spiritual path, to get you to be doing practices on a daily basis. But then he writes his Magisterial Ihya Ulum ad-Din, which is reviving the sciences of the religion. And I'm going to get into that. He then abridges it in Persian in a book called Kimya Sa'ada, The Alchemy of Happiness. And then, and this is the book, inshallah, I'm going to be talking about in a few days. He writes a book called Jawahir al-Quran. He writes it quite late. He's referencing all his other books in it. This book is his theory of the Quran. And what you realize from this book is his entire tradition revolves around the Quran. Everything the Imam was doing is really revolving around the Quran primarily, and then the Sunnah of the Prophet secondarily. So he is a jurist of the first order, and he brings his juristic worldview into the Quranic world and into the prophetic world, but it also is working in his theological perspective and in his spiritual perspective. Now, the third book is very interesting. It's called Kitab al-Arba'in fi Usul ad-Din. Again, it's relatively late. So these 3 are the abridgments. Actually, Jawahir al-Quran is 3 parts, and the third part is the Kitab al-Arba'in. This is the third part. So he said, when he wrote Jawahir al-Quran, he said, if you want, you can use this as a separate book. Because he wrote that, it was later published as a separate book, but it's actually part of the Jawahir al-Quran. So he shows you what the Quran is calling us to. And that is why his entire opus is basically a commentary on the Quran. And the prophetic life, as we know, is a commentary on the Quran. So it all goes back to the Book of Allah. The Prophet ﷺ Sunnah is an explanation of the Quran. Everything is from the Quran. It's all from the Quran. I'm not a Qurani. I'm 100% believe in the Kitab wa Sunnah. But the Sunnah is an explanation of the Quran. And we should understand that.